Hi, good morning, and welcome back to part two of our practical grant writing training hosted by Moore. I'm Karen Atkins, Public Information Officer at Kentucky River Foothills, the community action agency that operates the Moore program. Like part one, today's training webinar will be recorded and made available to participants at a later date. Moore is Madison Opioid Response and Empowerment. We work hard to sustain the fight against opioid use disorder and substance use disorder in Madison County. Please engage with us throughout today's training. If you have any comments or questions, please send them to us at any time using the Q&A feature. We will open up the Q&A portion at the end of today's training. Now let's get started. I'm pleased to welcome back our trainer, Pam Baston. Pam, I'll hand it over to you.
Welcome, everyone. Thanks for coming back. This is part two. For those of you who might not have been at the first webinar, my name is Pam Baston. I've been in the field for 40 years, substance abuse and mental health, and I have written grants for over 20 years. And in about a 6-year period, I brought in $100 million. That was doing this on a very part-time basis in addition to a full-time job. So I will be teaching you the techniques that I use that worked for me. Then you'll have to take them or leave them or adapt them as it makes sense to you. I also need to be clear that this is more of a generic grant writing training. This is not specific to HRSA RCORE, though I will work a few examples in. So just keep that in mind. Okay, so, whoops, sorry about that. So what we're going to do is focus today on response, what your sample response would be to what you plan to do about the need that you identified prior. So you might remember that last time we talked about statement of the need or statement of the problem. And then what happens next is you say, well, what are you going to do about that? What do you propose? What's your proposed response? And almost every funder has a name like that or a title like that of this next section. So I'm giving you an example. This is not a HRSA response, but this is one for a trauma grant. And just to give you the sense of the detail. So we're telling them that a number of factors contributed to our selection of trauma-focused cognitive behavioral therapy, TFCBT. First, it most closely aligned with the demographics, which in this case, I mean the age, the race and ethnicity, the urban and rural nature of the population of focus and their families and their associated needs. So what I'm doing here is I'm making it clear we didn't just run our fingers through the yellow pages and jump, grab whatever had a snazzy name, that there was a method to our madness, that we looked carefully at the demographics in these particular types of demographics and then looked for what most closely aligns to meet those needs. And that's how we picked this particular evidence-based approach. And so I highly recommend you do something similar if you are in your grant going to be selecting one or more evidence-based practices. In the case of this grant that I wrote, it did happen to be for two communities. One was African American and one was largely Hispanic. And so we made clear that we let the grant reviewer know that this model had been tested on these populations and found to be effective, and that even some of these materials are available in Spanish. This is important. Don't assume that your reviewer understands all of this or knows all the ins and outs of your program. And this is a way for you to let them know that you were paying attention to the right things. So we also mentioned that this trauma-focused CBT aligns with the needs related to the type of trauma exposure that they had experienced, whether that was depression, that resulted in depression, anxiety, mistrust, shame, externalizing behaviors. So it was important for them to know that these are the conditions that were addressed by this model. And that we then created a chart that showed what are the outcomes we were hoping to obtain with this model, and then how does that align with the actual model. So you'll see here, our project was called PACT, And it was, the left column shows the outcomes. We wanted to reduce post-traumatic stress. We wanted to reduce depression, anxiety, the externalizing behaviors, and reduce any sexualized behaviors. And then we showed in the right what the essential elements are of this model and how they do align. We got very good points in this section. I think a perfect score actually in this section, because we didn't leave anything, or take anything for granted. We made sure the reviewer knew that we put a lot of thought into the selection, and that, yes, in fact, there's a very close connection between the outcomes that we're hoping to achieve with our population and the nature of the components of the evidence-based model. So we also talked about learning a lot about collaborative practice over the 46-year history that this particular program had, and that we were applying that to design a advisory committee. And not every grant requires you to do an advisory committee, but if so, it's important for you to make sure that the reviewer knows that you have a good handle on your community and who the most relevant partners are. And in this case, we created a youth leadership advisory team composed of community youth, including pregnant and parenting teens. And we did this in each of the 2 target communities because our target communities were very different. One was like rural, Hispanic, migrant, farmer community, and the other was more of an inner city urban community, largely African American. And so we would never presume to have one advisory council to do both just such disparate groups of individuals. And so we made sure that we created it this way and let the reviewers understand our thinking. And this is just a high level summary, by the way, of the information. I just grabbed a few excerpts to illustrate some points. So this would most certainly not be all of the narrative, but just key pieces of it. We made sure that we told the reviewer that we are not looking to give youth some kind of token responsibility, but that we will make sure they have an authentic voice, and that will help build participation and promote the use of services and offer any support for culture change that we would have maybe as a recommendation from some of our advisory members, in this case, teen advisory members, and that we would make sure they were involved in all aspects of program planning, development, implementation, and evaluation. And this is key. Some grants, like typically SAMHSA grants, require you to involve some constituency group, whether it's your project partners or whether it's a formal advisory board or of some kind. But basically, it's very different to involve them just in the conceptualization of the program on the front end. Certainly that's important. But then you want to involve them in planning and rolling it out, the whole implementation, and also evaluation, because what will happen is you'll get some evaluation data that, remember, data tells you something happened, but it doesn't tell you why. So it might show you that you've had some drop off in attendance. Well, you won't know why that is necessarily until you then follow back with your constituency groups, your population of focus, so forth and so on, and find out why did they, what do they think is the reason that people dropped off. And maybe you do some key informant interviews or some focus groups and try to find out what happened, and then you feed that back into program improvement. So it's very important to communicate with the grant reviewer. I mentioned in module 1 that I always talk to my grant reviewer. That is who I'm speaking to when I write grants. Take nothing for granted, assume that they don't know your area, they're not familiar with your programs, and so forth. Now, one thing that is something I noticed as a former grant reviewer myself is that a lot of people who write grants, when they get to this part where they describe what their proposed response is, they just kind of talk about, upon notice of grant award, we'll begin implementation. And it's kind of like, we'll just, if we build it, they will come. And there's very rarely a rich discussion about all those necessary ingredients that you must have in place in order for a program to be successful. So I offered a few here for your consideration. Things like, how will you identify your participants? Will you, if they're teens or young people, you want to use social marketing. No matter who you have involved, you'll want to have referral pipelines. And by referral pipelines, and I love that word because it does communicate that you will have a vast number of potential participants coming at you through multiple sources of referrals. And so we call those pipelines, and that is a way to make sure that you have plenty, because the biggest fear of funders is they're going to dump a bunch of money on a local program and that is promised to serve X number of individuals. And then lo and behold, that doesn't happen, or they fall far short. And it's often because they haven't thought through all of these different facets of programming. So how will you engage them? Once you do good social marketing and you do some good stigma reduction campaigns and things, and work with your referral sources and get those referral pipelines in place, how will you then engage these individuals? Will you use peer specialists? And of course, if you're doing something with youth, sometimes you have to use what we call near peers, because sometimes you can't use same age youth. They might not be developmentally mature enough to handle peer outreach, and to, maybe they're too recent in their own recovery and that kind of a thing. So you may use near peers. Will you use incentives? Will you provide, perhaps some type of reward? If they come to so many sessions, they get to maybe draw out of a fishbowl a chance at winning a music, what do you call those cards, gift cards, to buy music, or some movie tickets, or something that young people, or if this is for an adult program, something that adults would like to receive. How will you retain them in care? So suppose you identify them and you engage them, how do you keep them there? And that often includes barrier reduction strategies. Are you addressing transportation, childcare? Are you making sure the hours that you have service are conducive to your population? Many times we work with populations that are in publicly funded systems of care. They may have a couple different jobs. They may work the night shift. Are we making sure that the hours that we provide align with the population we're serving? And then how will you include their perception of care and other feedback in your ongoing continuous quality improvement, CQI? So your perception of care is important to get not only from your participants by asking them often, how things are going and what you could do to improve, especially if you notice they're starting to have attendance issues, or if they seem to not do as well for some reason, to figure out what's behind that. Often, if you ask your perception of care questions throughout the treatment process, you have time to correct any problems. But unfortunately, most programs wait until the client leaves, and it's sort of a last thing that they do for at the very end with like discharge. Well, by that point, it's too late. I mean, maybe it'll benefit you for other clients, but not for the ones that maybe you weren't successful with. And that's a real missed opportunity. But also, it's important to check the perception of care of your referral pipelines. Often they're the ones that see any problems that might be developing. They might know, hear through the grapevine from the clients themselves what they like or don't like. They might see things happening in criminal justice proceedings and things that maybe weren't impacted successfully by the program. And so they might want to give you that feedback as well. Some of the biggest complaints that referral agents have is that the program is hard to get into, that there's long waiting lists, that maybe the program hours are not conducive to care. There's lots of other barriers that happen with this perception of care that our referral sources will give us feedback. And if you haven't had a chance to test your own program by, pretending to be a client and calling and seeing what the phone service is like and how quickly you get connected and how quickly you get an appointment, and see how you're treated and what the interactions are like, you've missed a real opportunity to figure out what ways might be important for improving. So another area or criterion that is under the program response has to do with, and this came out of a HRSA grant application. It may or may not be relevant to the one that's out right now, just so you know. These points may not be correct and the items may not be correct. This is just something that I want to point out, that it's when you read these prompts, is what I call them, where you're then having to respond with narrative, pay attention to every word. And I highlighted the real keywords that, as a grant reviewer, again, it's been many years, but I noticed that grant reviewers, that grant writers often skip over some of these very important words. So for example, this prompt asks you, gives you awards points based on the clarity and comprehensiveness of the applicant's proposed methods for fulfilling all core activities as outlined in a particular section of the NOFO. So if it were me, I would literally type all the core activities up. I would put them in a chart. And one column would be called core activities, and the next column would be, what am I exactly going to do? What are my, and you'll see the word highlighted here, methods for getting those done? You know, you don't just parrot back the core activities and say, you know, check, we're going to do these. You have to provide some detail, make it real. How will you implement those core activities? What kinds of things must you do for those core activities to happen? And then any compelling justification for how the activities that you are responding to in your own particular way will advance our core's goal and fulfill the needs of the target population. And we'll talk about some examples in a minute. Also, the appropriateness of the methods proposed for fulfilling all the core and any additional activities you might propose, given the needs and characteristics of the target population. So let's take an example here. Let's say that one of your core activities was community outreach or outreach to your population of focus. So you might have that as a core activity. Well, maybe you're implementing this in a program. I'll use the example I did a minute ago that has a lot of migrant farm workers. Maybe they're transient and they come during certain seasons to pick fruit or to pick, you know, farm vegetables or what have you. Maybe there's a distrust of those individuals because maybe they're not being well treated by the people that hired them and put them to work. Maybe they might not all have their proper paperwork in place, and so they're always afraid they're going to be sent back to their country, let's say. Or maybe it is, I'm working with this African-American community where somebody plowed a big expressway right down the middle of their beautiful, tight-knit community, and that they used some kind of eminent domain law that plowed that through. And so it caused all kinds of distrust. So if you, and appropriately so, so if you are going to be serving a community through outreach, you would want to tell the grant reviewer, well, what's unique about your community that you plan to focus on, or what's unique about the population that you'll be focusing on that you will need to factor in to the outreach. Age is an issue if you're factoring in, you know, lots of social media as a way to market programming to younger people, and older people might do better with a handout or with outreach materials that are at laundromats or places that they might congregate. So putting that kind of time and thinking about exactly how this will be done. This slide is not mine. This was a very great slide that was developed by a HRSA project officer named Sarah, and I'm probably butchering her last name, but I think it's Afehi or something like that. But anyway, she presented this at a grant writing workshop that she and I did together. And so, and I'd asked her then, could I use the slide at some point in the future? And she agreed. So I decided to include that in to give you some really good ideas about a work plan, because I believe that is one of the requirements that you have to have for HRSA application for their NOFO, Notice of Funding Opportunity. So I won't go over this because you'll have these slides and you can read them yourselves. but these are things that HRSA looks for their work plans. So now we'll move into resources capabilities. This is sometimes called organizational capacity or staffing, or they might ask you about relevant experience. So again, we have, the first section is what is your need or what's the statement of the problem. We just finished going over what do you intend to do about it? What is your proposed approach or your methods? And now we're going into the resources and capabilities section. And this is where you are really supposed to be letting the grant reviewer know that you've got the capacity, you've got the bandwidth to pull this off, to do whatever you are promising to do. And you do understand, I'm sure, that way too many funders end up with grant writers who promise the world and where they get underwhelmed in the actual delivery. So this is where you really have to show, we have the capability to do this. So I'll give you some examples. Again, this is real text from a real grant. It might not relate to your HRSA grant, but we'll give you an idea of the kind of detail that is typically asked for. So our XYZ, whatever the name of your organization is, has implemented extensive programming with at-risk minority youth since our inception more than 47 years ago. So let's stop there. And so you now have let the reviewer know that not only have you been around for many, many decades, but you have been around serving, racial and ethnic minority youth, which is in this case, who we were proposing to serve. So you're not cutting your teeth on a new population. You're not serving a population that you don't already have credibility with. Theoretically, if you've been doing this for a long time, you would have some good experience in what you're proposing. And we mentioned that in that 47 years, 15 of those years have been implementing evidence-based programs as opposed to non-evidence-based programs, and that these evidence-based programs have been for diverse high-risk youth. And then we go on to say the factors targeted by our evidence-based practices include substance use, mental health, delinquency, bullying, school dropout, teen pregnancy, and sexually transmitted diseases, including HIV. And this is important because while some evidence-based practices are very narrowly focused on a topic, let's say substance use, or let's say teen pregnancy, most of us who have been doing this work for a long time know that it's very rare for a person to show up at a helping program with just one problem or one challenge. These things are often very interrelated, particularly poverty, community violence, family disruption, these kinds of things. And so the idea that you have experience in lots of other evidence-based practices targeting lots of other topics gives that grant reviewer some assurance that you'll have good breadth of your and scope. So we went on to name in 1, 2, 3 through 12 all the different programs that were evidence-based that we have been implementing in recent years. Again, that makes it more real than if you just say, hey, we implement evidence-based programs. We really do, we promise, versus here's the ones that we do, so we're seasoned. We are seasoned professionals. So also under the resources and capabilities, it's important to make sure that the reviewer knows that this isn't your first rodeo. And of course, if it isn't your first rodeo, that we have not just implemented millions or hundreds of thousands of dollars of grants, but look at that word successful, and these are sometimes just the little words that are left out. A lot of programs have implemented lots of grants. It doesn't mean they did it well. It doesn't mean they did it successfully. It doesn't mean that they're a provider in good standing. That's a term I use. There might be better ways to say that, but I make sure that when I'm writing a grant for an organization that I find out, are you meeting the targets that you've set out, or are you exceeding them? And if so, I make sure we say that, meeting and exceeding our targets, that all of our reports are timely, that we're considered, a provider in good standing. We've met all of our requirements. whatever it is. Then also, if you are a provider that has longstanding licensing, maybe your state requires you to be licensed if you provide prevention or treatment or some special programming. So make sure they know that you've had this license. That gives the reviewer and the funder knowledge that someone else is looking over your shoulder, that the funder from their Washington, D.C. federal perch, when they're not always able to travel and go on site visits, and when they have lots and lots of grantees, sometimes hundreds of them, that there's someone else keeping their finger on the pulse of what's going on. So mention that. The kinds of licenses you have if you're licensed, or if you're accredited or getting reaccredited. Those are the kinds of things that a grant reviewer would want to see under this organizational capability section. In this case, my provider had also been awarded the Miami Beach Gay and Lesbian Chamber of Commerce Award for the best nonprofit of the year. And so we mentioned that because this particular grant we went for really did a lot of outreach with gay, lesbian, transgender, and questioning youth. So we made sure that the funder knew, hey, we got an award for being very, open and very connected to this community and very non-judgmental. And that we have recognition every year from the Redland Christian Migrant Association. So that lets them know if you can't always just roll up into a particular, rural community, especially if folks don't know you or they have immigration issues or things of that nature, that you have to have relationships built. And so this is a way that we did that in a very succinct way. Okay, I just went too far there. Okay, so often a federal grant government project officer will send an email or will send some kind of documentation around their being pleased with the way that a program is being implemented. And so we got permission in this instance from this was SAMHSA project officer to use her quote about what a great job we had done this is a different grant now. This was, I believe, a mental health training grant. And so we just included that quote in there. We often include quotes from clients or from parents. We often, I had one just recently where the parent talked about how they thought their child was lost to trauma, that they had become withdrawn and isolated and depressed and wouldn't get out of the bed, and that they just worried every day that that child would take their life. And then once they brought them into this program, their entire outlook changed. And they went into detail that was just so compelling about literally how this program saved their child's life. So sometimes, you don't have a lot of space and all that, but sometimes the ability to put in a key quote really, again, offers someone else's voice, authenticating that you're doing good work rather than you tooting your own horn. So most grants require a staffing chart. We have lots of differences of opinion about staffing. I'm just going to share with you my way. The questions that different opinion is to whether or not you can do lots of to be determined or TBH, to be hired positions. I, as a grant reviewer, was always troubled by that. If all the positions were to be determined or to be hired, it makes me immediately think that it's going to take a long time to round these people up. So what I always recommend to the folks that I work with is that if you have staff that, let's say you're running another grant, and that grant will be ending when the new grant you're asking to have funded goes into effect, and maybe you plan on sending some of those staff from the program that's expiring onto the new program. So, even if you're not 100% sure, but that this person would be a good fit, it's in my mind better to provide an example of the kind of staff that you are proposing that is likely to even accept that position rather than just to be determined. First of all, it shows the reviewer that you have a good handle on the level of qualification needed. and because you've then given them a sample of the person's qualifications. The other thing you can do is you can interview a few individuals and have them as contingent hires and put in their resumes and bios and describe them in the grant. And if you get the grant, then you hire those individuals. If you don't have the time to do all of this, or you don't get support to do this, at a minimum, I feel like you should have your program coordinator or project director, whatever you call your lead person, figured out, because it's scary to think about having a very short time to be able to get your program rocking and rolling, and you're literally floundering around trying to find people to fill positions. And then who does that fall on? If you don't even have a project director to do all that work, who does that fall on, and how quickly does your startup really happen? So here I want to show you that you put the staff position title, in this case, project coordinator, what their LOE is, their level of effort. In this case, it's 100%. Some grants tell you that the project director has to be 100%. If not, most of the grants that I've worked with expect that person to at least be 50%. When you start getting into the 10 and 15 and 20%, that's a couple hours a week. And that's usually not enough to keep a project really on track and highly functional. So even if you end up weaning that percentage down over time as your program staff step up their game and are doing a good job and implementation is going smoothly, even if you do that later, at least consider having a good level of effort out of the gate. So here, I wanted to point out that not only is it important to show what the credentials are, and in this grant, we had to attach the person, John Smith's resume, but letting them know that they have a master's degree, they're a certified addiction professional. And in this particular grant that this chart is from, it was a homeless grant. And it was important for me to let them know that this person that we had picked for the project coordinator experienced homelessness as a youth due to domestic violence. So you've got somebody there who really understands this population, because that is often a question, particularly SAMHSA will always ask that. Not just their qualifications, but what experience have they had with similar projects and with similar populations of focus. I'm not sure whether HRSA does that or not, but keep in mind that these are all, things for you to consider. So we also then have to mention what their role is, that they'll work closely with the executive director, they'll work closely with the university evaluators, making sure the project's running smoothly, they'll manage clinical and management staff, they'll do the random fidelity checks of the evidence-based program to maximize adherence to the evidence-based interventions. So again, and I shared with you in your first module, that one of the things that grant writers look for is continuity from one section to the next, to the next, to the next. So if you're saying you're implementing evidence-based practices, well, then you should have fidelity monitoring in job descriptions. The fidelity monitoring should be in your staffing chart. Somebody should be in charge of checking on the staff to make sure if they're supposed to be implementing module 3 on the 3rd week, and they're supposed to have a group format and have certain materials in hand, that's exactly what happens. So these are the things that I always try to put into these charts, just to make sure we have really good continuity. Now, I mentioned in the first module the importance of creating what we call boilerplate template text when you have downtime. So before you have the grant award hitting the street, or the grant application, or the notice of funding opportunity, before that hits the street, it's really good to start developing boilerplate. And let's be realistic. Even though a sample timeline will vary by the type of grant you are applying for, many, probably 75% of the activities are going to be the same, no matter what new startup you have. So here's some examples. You want to first alert whoever your constituency is that you got the grant award. Now, in my case, I will always like to alert the governor, or if I'm working with a tribe, the tribal leaders, because that means you're going to get buy-in early on. And remember, we want sustainability from the beginning. We want to focus on sustainability. So you don't want this grant to just, open up with a whimper in a small community and then start banging on their door 4 years later, wanting to know why they're not going to pick up your grant for sustainability. So you want to bring all these people in from the beginning. Maybe you even get some news media, local paper, whatever is relevant for your community. But you also want to make sure you alert your population of focus and all your strategic partners and your staff. Everybody should know, hey, we got this thing, and have this kind of kickoff implementation meeting. You have things to do like hire staff, like order your supplies, sometimes you have pre-service training you have to do, or in-service training. Sometimes you're getting training in evidence-based practices from a developer that might take place in another state, or it might take place virtually. There's all these things that you have to do to implement a new program. And so I'm giving you some examples of what this looks like, but again, highly recommend that you develop some of these things in advance. Let me go back a minute. I did want to show you. I never have time in the responsible staff column to write all the names of the people out, and nobody knows who they are anyway. So I put their titles, and then I abbreviate and put a little answer key here at the top so that I can minimize the amount of text that I use, since almost all grants have a strict page limit. And so if you start typing in total names and all of this, it just takes up way too much space. So I put this little answer key at the top. So now we're down to our second to last section here. This is on writing goals and objectives. Now, I do need the caveat here that every funder has different ways of describing goals and objectives. I am going to teach you the way I learned and the way that, that I believe is accurate. Some funders confuse goals and objectives, and the most important thing is you probably need to line up what you do with what they're expecting, what each funder expects. But the goals and objectives really do differ in their degree of specificity, accountability, and time, even though they often do describe desired conditions or outcomes. But this whole notion of specificity, accountability, and time is where you'll see some differences. So typically programs will have one or two goal statements. And I like to keep mine to one or two. And usually you can get that goal straight off the notice of funding opportunity. If it says something like, the purpose of this funding opportunity is to, expand and enhance drug treatment for adolescent youth, or to expand pregnancy prevention programs to high-risk communities. So whatever their goal is the goal that you will want to adopt, because if they're funding you for that purpose, you really ought to be making sure you're saluting that goal. Now you'll put it in your own words and you'll twist it a little to make it more community focused, where their goal may be more nationally focused. But generally that goal is that desired final outcome. So I always think about goals and outcomes as being one and the same, or being closely related. So if my goal is to reduce drug use, my outcome might be, what percent did I reduce? Did I reduce it by 10%, by 20%? If I increase high school graduation rate, maybe that's my goal in a different grant. Well, then, what was my outcome? Did I increase it by how much? 20%, 30%, 10% over the prior year? So usually you'll know you're dealing with a goal when it has words like reduce, or increase, or expand, or enhance. Those kinds of terms generally will precede the actual goal. Now, in contrast, objectives are specific performance targets against which some progress can be measured. They're very measurable, they're reasonable, they're time-bound, and the objectives are how you accomplish your goals. So if you were going to, let's say, reduce teen pregnancy, There's lots of different ways to do that. Well, how do you plan to do that? And those are your objectives. And, it usually involve things like, how do you first recruit the pregnant teens or the teens that are likely to become pregnant, the high risk teens? How do you figure out who that group is? How do you figure out who is at risk for becoming pregnant? What kind of data do you review? What kind of needs assessment do you look at? What kind of geography, looking at certain geographic areas where maybe there's a higher teen pregnancy rate, that might let you know, hey, we better focus in this community, but maybe we'll start much younger than when these kids are turning up pregnant. So those levels of details are the objectives. So goals are broad, they're general, they talk about sometimes goals being like a dream or a wish or a vision, but usually by itself, it's not always able to be validated as it is without all the detail that goes with it, which you will find in the objectives, which are more narrow, precise, and concrete. So as I mentioned, goals typically align with the problems identified in your statement of need or your logic model. And if you do a logic model, you'll see this connection. And then the objectives are sort of those interim steps. Now, one of the things that I highly recommend in grant writing is that you read very carefully, and we talked about this in module 1, what are the required activities, or I think in HRSA language, I think they call them core activities that you are required to do, because those can become your objectives. And I sometimes find it humorous that, and it's kind of sad really, when people are scratching their heads, like dreaming up all these objectives for their grants. And you want to say, well, wait a minute now, aren't these sort of dictated to you on some level? Again, how you get there and how nuanced they are and who you apply them to and how exactly you do it is up to you. But usually these objectives are very much spelled out in the form of core activities or required activities. And your job is to take those and reformat them a little into objective language. So this is a very partial example here. This is not a full example, but just to show you, and then I know we've got a couple more and then we're going to open up for questions. So if your goal was to decrease opioid use among a certain population, then how do you do that? Well, maybe in your case, you're taking that overall goal and you are going to target athletes. Maybe that's the subgroup that your grant is going to serve, 12 to 17-year-old athletes. And maybe they get a lot of injuries in being an athlete and you're wanting to reduce the opioid misuse, maybe the pain meds that they take for their injuries. And so then so now you're saying by the end of year 1, or you might say by June 30, 2022, whatever your date is, these are usually time bound. An objective is usually time bound. And it's detailed how many. You're going to do 100 youth athletes are going to be served. And then you have a lot of activities that have to be done in order to do that. So you have to identify the highest risk athletes. You have to get your hiring and your evidence-based training in place. You have to start enrolling them or doing some kind of assessment to get them in. You have to allow for a dropout factor because not everybody that starts will probably finish, and you're trying to shoot for 100. And so you got to capture their baseline opioid use so you know if you've made any progress. And so there's no 100% right or wrong way, and these could all be improved upon substantially. I just wanted to show you, and then how I will take goal 1, and then that would be objective 1, activity 1.1.1, so forth and so on, where you kind of line them up together. So here are some examples of partial examples of HRSA core activities. Provide culturally and linguistically appropriate education to all these different individuals, providing access to naloxone, screening and referring. So these could become objectives, and then all of those lots of little details that go into making these happen could become your activities. And lastly, and we won't spend a lot of time on this, but this is the data collection. Every funder pretty much has some kind of data collection, evaluation, or performance measurement requirements. And I've given you some sample text here. Most of the grantees that I work with, or the providers, organizations that I work with, hire outside independent evaluators. That is usually the best model. That may not be necessary if all they're doing is collecting some data that's being automatically entered in by the program staff anyway, so that really all you're doing is printing out, or adding up and analyzing the data that then come back out from this process. Maybe you have an evaluation consultant. Maybe you don't need an evaluation team. Some grants require you to have one. Some grants tell you how much you have to spend, or that you can't spend more than 15 or 20%, which does typically end up being the kind of average amount, at least from what I see, is most evaluations, if they're handled by an outside individual, are about a 15 to 20% of the total grant award by and large, but that's just, ballpark. And so I've given you some ideas here of some of the reporting requirements, and reminding them that if what you're evaluating is an evidence-based program, that you might need to involve the developer of the evidence-based program. Because if your developer if you implement an evidence-based model and it says, and I'm making this up, that you're supposed to get 40%, will reduce their opioid use by a certain percent, and lo and behold, you only reach 20%, the first thing you do is make sure that you implemented with fidelity, that your implementation was appropriate. If not, you have to do wayward correction. You correct your wayward implementers. But if you implemented with fidelity and you did and your population you served was very similar to the one that the developer claims got this 40% outcome, well, then you need to call the developer up and say, hey, like, what gives? This didn't work out for us. Can you maybe take a look at what we've done? Or has something happened? Are we missing something? So that's always good to get them involved if appropriate. Here, I let folks know that we involve all of our staff, the partners, and the community in the evaluation, particularly when it relates to looking at the data and informing any quality improvement, continuous quality improvement, CQI. And also we talk about, how we enter the data. This would all be very specific to your funder, and their requirements. We talk about process and outcome data and how it's received and analyzed. It'll be promptly organized. It'll be communicated. The worst thing you can do is collect a bunch of data and nobody ever knows what it says, and that you don't make improvements based on it. Then here's some example outcomes that we happen to look at, or we were recommending. So, individual or contextual or program factors that were associated with particular outcomes and how durable the effects were. We mentioned that we will share all the findings with community partners. We talk about process to collect information, that we're looking at demographics, we're looking at what training occurred, we're looking at, just picking out a few of these, what took place for cultural competency, were we implementing with fidelity, who dropped out and why, and you want to look at demographics to see, did we have, were we having more racial and ethnic minorities drop out than others, and why might that be, and are they not feeling welcomed in our program? So all of these have sort of backup implications, but these are just a few examples of some of the questions that might be asked in a typical evaluation. I also wanted you to note that these little check marks, if you run out of space, because we do talk a lot about formatting, and bullets, these are like bullets, take up a lot of space, because look at the end of each one of these bullets with this check mark have white space. So sometimes I'll run them all together, but I separate each sentence with a check mark. So that way you would have them all go in a big line, and you can quickly see where one starts and one stops by looking at the check mark, but it doesn't burn up a bunch of your space.
Hey, everyone. Sorry, I just abruptly cut you off, Pam. I do apologize for that. This is Karen Atkins again. I am bringing Pam here on the screen.
No problem. So let's see here. Okay. Do we have any questions at this point? And this is going to be for the questions that we would have would be for either module 1 or module 2.
Pam, this is Travis Witt. We had a few questions during module 1. The question that kind of floated to the top was, they stated that their organization does community needs assessments on a regular basis, but it doesn't collect the specific data. They also stated that they've asked their staff to collect specific data points, but they've got some resistance from their staff. So do you have any experience with that type of situation?
Sure. And by the way, I did try to undo the camera, but it says it has to be done by the host. So just so you know that part.
I've got you in just a second.
And no problem. So, and that's not necessary. The answer will still be the same, which is that needs assessment is very important. And it's also, it can be very expensive. And so the situation may be that that your funder expects a needs assessment, but you may not have the wherewithal to do it. So a couple things. One, let your funder know that you are in the process of a needs assessment, that you have already gathered what we would call archival data. So what I mean by that is, even if your staff are not happy about you getting data that you want them to collect, surely there's data on these topics or on these data elements available through the internet. So for example, if it were a teen pregnancy grant, you would go to your health department, you would go to other sources, maybe even work with some of your schools or find out from your local schools if they have teen pregnancy programs on campus. So do everything you can to get what you can to show you've at least made an effort. There's so much data available now that's available online. And then you would put a sentence that says, these are the data that we have available currently. We are in the process of expanding on our data opportunities to gather this in our own community by our staff. And so, to kind of buy time to let them know, you realize that the data sets that you're providing online might not be the best or the most relevant to exactly what you're doing, but it's the closest you can get, and B, it's not going to be all you do, that you will also be trying to supplement. As to the staff, that's a little more troubling because I'm trying to come up with in my head a reason why staff would be reluctant to gather data, especially if they know that you have to have it for funding, which means their jobs will then have a way to be funded. And two, everything we do should be data informed. You don't want to go get surgery and have your surgeon wing it because he's not using the best practice guidance. He's just kind of throwing up his own information. It kind of defies logic to me. Now, I do know that in some instances, in some communities, and particularly in Native communities, data have been gathered and used inappropriately and in harmful ways. And so there may be that kind of reluctance from a cultural perspective. And that's a longer term problem to solve that might involve making sure that the people collecting the data are from the population you're trying to gather it from. That also remember that data is almost always aggregated. It's not identifiable, so that you can't drill down to who it is that person is. And so there may be a few things you can do that way to minimize any potential concerns about the data. But not having it is going to be real hard to justify in terms of any funding.
So in some of our more rural areas, some very specific targeted, say, county level data might not be available. Would it ever be acceptable to use data from a comparable area?
Sure. You always do the next best thing. But remember, I think in module 1, I mentioned it's always best to talk to your reviewer. So I don't mean personally, but I mean in your grant, you're explaining to them, that as we are refining our efforts to gather these data locally, we did the best we could. and we found a comparable community. And you can even say this is due to privacy concerns. I've lived in rural communities since I've been 18, and I'm well aware of how sometimes, there is that reluctance. And so you just explain that this reluctance is here, that we've gone to the neighboring community. You would want to say things like, how are they similar? Are they similar in size? Are they similar in demographics? By that, I mean, not only age and gender, but, race and ethnicity. Are they similar in other ways, like level of education? So show how comparable they actually are, and show that grant reviewer, hey, it is what it is. I mean, you don't have a magic wand, but that they just need to know, hey, we're trying here. We're doing the best we can. We're in an improvement process. We believe we will get there. Or ask for, look at your budget and see if you're adding something in the budget that would help you maybe hire somebody with some expertise, an epidemiologist or somebody else who might find ways to get you where you need to go. For example, you might be familiar with the term proxy data. And I am not a researcher, and I don't play one on TV, and I didn't stay at a Holiday Inn Express, but I do know that the proxy data, for example, one proxy measure for sexually transmitted disease can be pregnancy, because obviously if somebody got pregnant, there was no condom used. And so that may be a close indicator of something that you may not have the exact data you want, but you get the next best thing. So there's a lot of clever ways to get close to where you need to be, but you may need the help of a true data professional.
I like the idea of using the fact that we don't have available data as almost a need in and of itself.
Yes.
Within your application.
Yes. And put a budget item next to it. If you have the funding to, the room in your budget, even if it's enough for a data consultant, even if you're not going to engage an entire data epidemiology study or some kind of big needs assessment, the fact that you at least put some money in for a data consultant to advise you, even if it means you do it next year or the year after the actual execution of it, that's good. Also, most communities I shouldn't say most, many communities have a drug coalition, and they're usually prevention, but they gather data around school dropout, around drug use in schools, around expulsions, around arrests. You've got drug-related arrests that you can get. That's public domain. To me, as if I were a reviewer, which I have been, I would say, show me you are getting as close as you can to this as possible. So at least get your local arrest data for drugs. At least get your, we know that in small communities, and I'm dealing with this past week, where somebody overdosed, but they're calling it a natural death because their family's private and embarrassed. And, so those are the kind of things that we know aren't necessarily real numbers. And you can also say that, this is what we show. We know firsthand that these numbers for overdose are lower than actual because of the stigma in our rural community. So you just need to convince the grant reviewer you're doing the best you can, you're trying. You maybe even have a data element in there for a data consultant just to advise you on how to proceed in the future. That you always want your grant, what you say in your grant should be evidenced in other ways, your budget, your job descriptions. So maybe you go back to your job description of your project director, or if you have an evaluator, and you add a little bullet in there that says, work continually to improve this is one of their tasks, to improve their data collection opportunities and data access, put that as a task in somebody's job description, and then tell the grant reviewer you did that, seed budget and job description for additional information so that they know that this is a legitimate thing you're doing.
Saves you a lot of space on your application too.
It does, absolutely.
Referring them elsewhere.
Yes, it does.
I don't want to harp on data too much because you've covered a lot, and you covered a lot in your presentation, but we did have a question on Monday about timely federal sources of data. And I know that there's, a handful of the large organizations, but would you care to, where would you go for that kind of timely as possible?
Yeah. Okay. So basically, one of the things that I would do is to, first of all, again, note in the application, these are the most relevant data that we have, and that the most current, rather, excuse me, data that we have, and that it came from a federal source. And what it is sometimes there's a year or two delay in the time that it's collected than the time it's reported. But if that is the most recent, I mean, you don't have a magic wand, you can't make it up. One thing that I would do is usually there's a phone number associated or contact information, an email, and I would consider following up with whoever's contact information is at the bottom of the data that you are looking at, and contact them and say, these data are 3 years old. Like, there's some CDC data that's like, we're still in 2019 for, I think it's overdoses. And we're like, wow, we're, halfway to 2022 already, but that's the most current. But if there's a phone number there that you can, or email, and you can ask them, do you have any other data to supplement this that is more current? And if not, when will the next data set drop on your website? Then you can tell the grant reviewer, while this is the most, currently available data, we have inquired or reached out to the feds and have been informed that a new data set will drop September of 2021. So they know that not only did you go the extra step, but that you will then be using the most relevant data when it's available. But that is a common problem.
Sometimes you can get your hands on provisional data. There's a handful of other words for it. Is that acceptable to use in an application?
Yeah, as long as it's not embargoed. I've done that before. I've used provisional data. Usually what it is that it's partial data, like maybe the tables that they're going to report on have multiple age groups, but they've only got one age group ready, that kind of a thing. But so it's not, usually by the time it would be released, it's not like it's going to change. It's that they're going to add new dimensions to it, but it won't affect what is usable. But if it has the word like embargoed on there, then you're really not supposed to re-release it. If you can get, and I get it now and then, if you can get embargoed information, that's really good. You have an inside scoop and read it, and maybe you hint at it or something, but I would not, I would be very careful about using something if it's embargoed, just because whoever gave it to you, your source, may be not real happy with that. Maybe your last embargo data you ever get.
Right. Pam, here's a question that we had gotten today. Can different people write different parts of the grant application?
That is an outstanding question. So first of all, it may be the only way you get it done, because some of these turnarounds are outrageous. They're a matter of weeks, and it's a massive, I get so upset sometimes when I see these proposals, because sometimes they are literally massive. And they don't have to be, to pick a good contender, to pick a good grantee. And I always want to say, I wish the person who wrote this would be forced to sit in a room and write to that application, because then they would never do it again. I could promise you that. And anyone who's ever done this knows exactly what I mean. They don't have, and luckily for the most part, most of the federal agencies are now bringing these applications back down to a more reasonable level, because what happens is the mom and pop community groups that are sometimes the most in need and the most aware and have the most credibility with their population of focus don't have big budgets to hire fancy grant writers. So the bigger, more complex the applications are, the more advantage that gives to the already, well-financed or more greatly financed organizations, and leave some of the ones that need it the most out, which is really not fair. And we have a lot greater emphasis now on fairness and equity, and it will take us many, many, many years to be where we need to be, but we are starting that process more recently. That's one thing. Two is that when you have different people writing, which is inevitable, you should have what we call a one voice expert. And a one voice expert would be somebody who is almost like a copy editor or some kind of editor, or just somebody that has good reading and communication skills, that can read all the way through and make it as if it were a one voice writer. it won't necessarily affect your points if you have all these different writers. But as a grant reviewer, I can remember many times literally getting whiplash from reading, section A, they talk about substance use. Section B, they talk about substance abuse. Section C, they talk about alcohol, tobacco, and other drug use, where people don't even use the same phrases for the major topic that you're writing about in a grant. So one of the things, if you don't have a one voice writer, or you're just trying to make them more cohesive, because these should almost just tell a story from beginning to end, is that you send out a common terms list or a preferred terms list, kind of like naming conventions. Like, we will all use the word substance use. And you probably already know we don't use the word substance abuse anymore. That has been dropped from the current lexicon. It's substance use, and that use may result in a substance use disorder, an SUD, but we don't really talk about substance abuse anymore, unless it's in a name of a research article or a name of the program or something where obviously you can't change that. You should be talking about substance use, or words like, we talk about, another way is, we don't talk about addicts. We don't use words like the addict or to reach addicts. We talk about reaching people affected with an A, affected by substance use or substance use disorders, or affected communities. And we try not to blame communities for the struggles that they're having. So you have to find, affected communities is a nice way versus, high risk community. And so we're all working on our terminology that way. But if you could create that list and then have every writer make sure that those are how they refer to whatever they're writing about in their section.
Thank you. This kind of just flows perfectly with that question that you just answered. Are grammar and punctuation really important, or do reviewers just focus on the content of the proposal?
Wow, that's a very individual thing, depending on your grant reviewer and whether or not, like, they were an English major, which would be your greatest nightmare, or who they are. But this is the one thing that will drive a grant reviewer totally crazy: are run-on sentences that don't make any sense. Putting the comma in the wrong place, no big deal. Having the occasional typo, no big deal. Even some of the best grants I've ever written that have been funded and got great scores, usually it's a function of just not having time. I mean, there have literally been grants I have submitted that it was such a tight time frame, I had not even read it from beginning to end to even know if it all made sense, and still gotten it. But that's because I also do a lot of template text in advance, or boilerplate text, if I'm writing about the same community and that I've already written about before, or the same organization, where you should already have a lot of this written up about what your community is like, and always put some strengths in there, because that's the other thing that, who wants to invest a lot of money in a ship that's sinking, where they're like, yeah, you have a high need, but do you have the capacity, because you're so overwhelmed and underwater? How do we know that we're going to invest all these dollars and anything good's going to happen? So you got to show some strengths in there, whether or not that's, that you've implemented similar programs in the past successfully, or that you've got a really great A team that you're going to bring in to do, or that they're from the community, they have entree and credibility with the community members that you're trying to work with, and so forth. But just and I have a family member who I will not name, because you probably know them, that just cannot write an entire sentence. Like, it just goes on and on and on. And I have to read it and reread it and read, like, what are they trying to say? That kind of stuff will kill it. But the occasional typo, or maybe you didn't use the right verb tense, that doesn't really matter in the big picture. But unless there's a lot of them, because remember, you're going to have to be writing reports to show what you're doing, and that what you're doing is successful. And the feds don't want to have to get it and redo it, or have you redo it. Plus things like if you don't want to make those mistakes, if you're showing, I like to show little examples sometimes of some of the engagement posters, because really have to be big into engagement. You don't say, if we build it, they will come. You have to really think through, how am I going to reach the people that are going to be in my pipeline that come to my program? What am I doing with social media? What am I doing, Facebook and other things? What am I doing with radio and TV and posters like that are in high risk areas like, or high access areas like laundromats, barbershop, grocery store, places that everybody goes at some point or that many people go, high visibility places. So sometimes I'll show a little picture of something we've designed as an outreach poster. And you don't want like bad grammar or typos on that kind of thing. Anything that would be, real public facing, you want to make sure look pretty good.
Mhm. That definitely makes a lot of sense. I'm going to kind of shift gears here. So you said that you brought in over $100 million while doing it part-time. And
Right.
in the training, you said very part-time, I think something along those lines. So do you
Yes.
have any tips or advice for, the question is, how can I manage grant writing with my other job duties? So we've got a lot of people that wear multiple
Yeah.
hats and
Yeah.
being able to balance it all out. Do you have any tips for that?
Yeah. Run away. No, we are unicorns. I'm convinced of it because you have to give up a lot in order to do it that way. And so, luckily, when I did most of my writing, my kids were already out of the house, and at least I didn't have to choose between childcare and writing grants. And I have always had a full-time job, always, and then written grants on top of that. So you give up a lot of nights, you give up a lot of weekends, and you every time you do it, you say, I will never do this again. It's like I will literally never write another grant again. And then, then you're back at it. It's like childbirth, you forget all the pain, especially when you get them, when you start getting them. Or what gets me is when I'll have communities still call me today that say, that grant you wrote us back in, 1998, like we still have it, like we've gotten other funding for it, but here's all these people that have been successful or whatever because of that. And that does feel good, and that does make it feel like it's worth it. But I'll tell you what it does make you really good at if you have to do this, which is the pre-preparation work. I know I sound like a broken record, but getting as much of this boilerplate stuff done as you can in advance so that you're not sitting there with a blank page. You're able to kind of pop things in and then tweak them versus starting over. And I'm really big about an outline. So I will take the outline or the template, okay, that you're going to write to that has all the little prompts, and I will start making a bullet list. What do I want to mention here that might be unique about the needs of this community, for example? Um, so, and then I'll put a couple little notes there, and then I go look for my boilerplate. But I want to first, I don't want to start with boilerplate. I want to start with making it fresh. So what is important here? And plus our landscape changes all the time. So like I'm on a couple different projects right now, one of which I learned last week that, and I won't say the state this has happened in, but where the child welfare system has a new unofficial policy, don't ask, don't tell, on anything related to substance use. So and you won't find it in writing, but they are not to bring up, do you have a substance use problem when they're merely meeting with the family. Well, I'm so appalled, I don't even know what to even think about that. Like, why would you knowingly not bring up the number one problem that affects child welfare families? Why would you let a problem that's probably there, that probably is why they're sitting in front of you and why they're fixing to lose their kids, permanently? Why would you let that go and not ask? Like, why don't you care enough to ask? And it's because of tight budgets, and they don't want, then they have to drug test, and then they have to do this and that, and on and on. Well, hello, that's your job. That's why you were called child welfare. So like I would put all that in, like if that's a new development, that won't be in any of my other boilerplate. I'm gonna find a way to work that in. Or if you have something else going on in your area that's new or that's relevant, I would just put little bullets in these area in the template to remind yourself to do at least a paragraph about that. And then I start sorting my boilerplate. So I can literally get a 10-page grant pulled together, usually in 2 days. I have most of what I need in there, placeholders. It may be way too long. It may be a little rough. It may lack transitions. It may have a lot of yellow space, like insert the latest statistic, update this, add in the new staff titles or whatever. But it's a lot of nights and weekends. And the other thing I learned the hard way is that I would always put it off. Like I would say, oh my, I just need this weekend off. Like I'm not going to work this weekend. I have plenty of time if I do this next weekend. And something always happens. Just put it down on your calendar. There will be an emergency room run. There'll be a small fire in your home. Something is going to happen that will absolutely stop you from getting it done. And you will just, hate your life. So I just rather get it done sooner and then have my weekends on, closer to the back end of things and be in a tweaking mode. And I don't know if that helps, but also another tip, don't ever tell anybody that you're a grant writer. If you just like that has to be the private news between you and whoever your clients are, because like I literally get followed at the grocery store. Like I just want to make up that I have a whole different type of job, because you will be inundated and everybody will have a sad story and they're all true and they're all very sad. And and they could easily suck you in and you'll have no life whatsoever and you'll be, divorced and, whatever. So, I mean, I'm really not even kidding much about that it can be that consuming if you don't find a way to work smarter and faster and more efficiently.
I mean,
More
speaking of working smarter, I mean, it sounds like even as something as simple as breaking it down into sections, I think is very important advice to put out there, because I think a lot of people with no experience would start at the beginning, work their way down one time, the same way that you would write a paper or write an email even. And it sounds like in your experience, that is definitely not the way to go about it.
I'm glad you brought that up, Travis, because that reminds me that I had neglected to mention that when you have multiple writers, which you really should, even if it's just the budget person's writing the budget, for goodness sakes, I don't do, it's like I don't do windows, I don't do budgets, because it's impossible to write the budget and the narrative at the same time, unless they were giving you months and months to write the grant. And there should always be somebody, we used to call it the man plan, and I realize that's not gender sensitive, so the person plan, it's just that it rhymed before and it's kind of nifty. But anyway, whoever puts the plan together of who the people are, that's also usually a budget person or another group of people. So what is usually best to do the one voice is that not only do you have this page of these are the terms we're going to use, and also giving the names of the positions. Is it a project director, a program director? Doesn't necessarily matter. But is it an outreach coordinator, an outreach specialist, a drug ed like who are these people? You don't want it to be the substance abuse specialist when we just said we don't use abuse anymore. So not only everybody together, but you do a conceptual design meeting. And we usually will do 2 of these. One is, hey, the RFP, the request for proposal, or the funding opportunity award has just dropped. We now have it. We want, maybe somebody has taken the opportunity to go through first and get through it really do a good analysis. And then they meet with everybody, say, here's the deal. This is what this money is for. This is the age group. This is how we were thinking of proceeding. We were going to recommend, 3 counselors, an outreach specialist, a mobile van, whatever it is that you want to do. You have this to the whole team. Does this sound workable? Is there anything we're proposing that doesn't make sense? Is there a better way to do this? Does anybody have any other ideas? Whatever. And then so everybody's on that first page and they're writing their little bits and pieces from a common platform, common, foundation. And so that will also help where you don't have people, going off the road somehow, going rogue into something that doesn't even line back up with your grant. I mean, I've literally read them where the front talks about serving youth and the back talks about the adult service system. And you're just like, obviously nobody had a meeting, and there's not a lot you can do with a one voice with that. I also do a lot of use tools in your Word document to search for like how you phrase things. So if I want to make sure I don't have substance abuse, I might search for the word abuse, do a quick search, go through, make sure, and you might have the word abuse in there because it might have been child abuse, might have been an appropriate word, but just to make sure it's not with substance abuse, that kind of thing. So anything that just makes it more coherent. Plus, remember that Word, for the most part, does have a good grammar. Oh my gosh, what was that? I just remembered there's this really good free grammar check all I can do is look it up and send it to y'all. Maybe you could send it out to people, but it's better than the one that comes with Word that will do like little underlines if you've made a mistake or you've made a run-on sentence. Use the tools that Word gives you for one, because they're really pretty good. That'll get you pretty closer in the ballpark. But there's another one that a friend just shared with me.
Is it Grammarly?
Yes, thank you. Yes.
I've used Grammarly. It is like, it's a much more in-depth tool than
Yes,
just
and it's
using
free,
Microsoft
right?
Word. I think there's functionality that's free, and I think there's like a paid side of it, but
Or it might give you 30-day free and then you sign up, or you can
Yeah.
cancel, something like that. Yeah.
it's a
Thank
great
you.
service.
Yeah. Mhm.
Pam, can you talk about if there isn't enough space to comply with page limits, can I just leave some parts out if they don't seem important?
I would, if you have to leave things out, I always use the phrase, um, due to severe page constraints, the answer is abbreviated below, but a more full description is available on file or something like that. Nobody's literally ever one time ever asked me for it, but we usually have. We always save. I always tell people, you write the grant as if there are no page limits. You put what you think answers the question. Don't go beyond what they're asking necessarily, but at least fully answer the questions. You will undoubtedly be over limit. Save that, save it on your hard drive. Then go put draft 2, start hacking, cutting. And then you tell the person, the full description is available on file, but was cut due to severe page limitations. But after that, also make sure that you haven't put in super long, wordy descriptions of things that really could be abbreviated. And as a matter of fact, if you have somebody on your team or even in your friend group who you can trade with, hey, I'll come babysit your kids for one night if you review I've done this many a time. I don't have access to a copy editor this week, or my copy edit is 2 weeks behind. This grant's due Wednesday. I have a friend who's an English major. I'm like, will you review this? And then I'll owe you a big favor, and the biggest thing is I need it in page limits, and they'll go through. And sometimes they can find these easier than you. Like sometimes I may have crafted what I think is the most clever sentence on planet Earth, and I'm not going to cut that thing because I remember how long it took me to write it. Someone else may say, you know what, it didn't have that effect on me, and I just cut it, and hey, now we're in page limit, So sometimes you just have to have help, somebody else doing it. But also just make sure that you do a lot of abbreviations. So don't spell out the word substance use disorder more than once or twice in the beginning and then call it SUD. It's amazing how one word can often bring you a whole extra line of space. And if you do that through a 20-page proposal, you may literally gain a full page that you just from clever formatting. And I don't remember if I already told you, because I also do a little brief formatting class where you try eliminating all the spaces between paragraphs and just indent your first word of your new paragraph. So they all run together, but you can tell where the new paragraph starts by the indent. And then things like looking for paragraphs that only have a couple words at the end. And then you say, which ones can I cut to bring that up a line? And sometimes sometimes you have to cut 7 or 8 words to bring 2 words up a line, because where the words are, maybe where you eliminated them didn't have an effect on that particular line, but at the end you find where it does. But so yeah, lots of abbreviations as long as you've spelled them out. Even I'll say things like the project director hereafter referred to as PD. Like I abbreviate everything I possibly can. That'll bring you some space.
That's great. That's really good advice. I think we have one more question unless another one pops through in the meantime. And this is kind of a loaded question. And if you are as sick of hearing and talking about it as I am, I apologize at the beginning, but what impact has the pandemic, the COVID-19 pandemic, had on the landscape of grant writing or available grants in general?
Wow, that's a great question. And it's a good and bad one. Okay, the good one is there is so much money out here right now that people cannot spend it. I am telling you, there is so much out there. The first place I would go is your state agency, your single state authority, SSA, they're called. That's the job I used to have in Florida. Whoever's over the publicly funded drug treatment system. They got a doubling of their block grant, and the mental health group got a doubling of their mental health monies. Mental health has less money usually from the block grant, so they may not have as much excess or as much to go around as substance use. And also states got another year of SOAR money, which is state opioid response, which is now able to be spent also on stimulants, which are on the rapid increase and have always been around and always been a problem, but they're kind of being rediscovered, I guess. And so there's so much money out at the state level. Then there's a lot of new grants out. All of these funds came in because of COVID. So the good news is that's the good news of the COVID picture. The bad news is these are only going to be around for a couple of years. So then they'll go away unless we have some new pandemic. But basically what will happen is you whatever you write for these funds, and they're different, every state has a different protocol, you want to show how you plan to sustain them. So the real trick to getting those dollars is having a clever sustainability plan, which usually means you got to get Medicaid to pay for something or figure out insurance that can start paying for things like, I don't know that every state pays for peer recovery support, but it's absolutely essential to a positive outcome and should be being able to be reimbursed by Medicaid and by a state, by insurance. And sometimes those are late to get on the reimbursement page. So you would just show, here's the effort I'm going to put in to get this, to help this be sustainable, or I'm going to use these funds to do some real quality improvement, and I'm going to maybe not continue some of my programs that are less effective. And that's how I'm going to support the most effective ones, or whatever it is you come up with. The bad news from the pandemic is the obvious, unnecessary deaths, and and what it has done is put a real strain on, it brought out and exacerbated the inequities that have always existed, particularly for racial and ethnic minorities that have been, dealing with oppression and discrimination and all the other terrible things that have happened over the years. And they were in a difficult situation to begin with, and now they have the pandemic to wrestle with, and they may not have insurance. And the other thing is that and the thing that is very timely, and if you're writing a grant, you have got to think about putting this in right now. And I'm going to say this really carefully because I don't want this to come off the wrong way that I'm against benefits, because I'm not against benefits. But I'm working with a family right now, and I'm not having, it's a tragic thing that I'm dealing with, this family has 5 children. And I've been trying so much to help them, to just a vast extreme. We even literally bought a house for them to live in because they were going to all go into foster care. And now when the stimulus check came out, started coming out, the stimulus checks often for families that are affected by substance use end up going to drugs, massive amounts of drugs at once, and a big increase in overdose. Child care credit money, whatever that's called, came out in my community day before yesterday, or Friday, I think it was. I am now already dealing with some a potential overdose that I think was non-fatal, but also some total depletion of funds that would have gone to the first month's rent that are now gone because of drugs. And so these are very difficult situations to handle. In the case of the family I'm working with, we begged this person, let's have family members help you manage these checks that are coming in, because we knew they were on the way. And this person just, no, I don't need any help. I got this. And we're like, just begging, please, you'll be in charge. You'll have your hand on the steering wheel, but let's help. And that help was not accepted, and the money is already gone. And these are realities that are happening all over the place. And those are the kinds of cutting edge, keeping your finger on the pulse when you write grants. Because remember, these grant reviewers, they want to know what's going on. And also they often are not as aware as you are of what's happening. So you're now educating them about a concern. Maybe you have a solution. I didn't have one. I wasn't thinking fast enough, other than trying to, get family members to be involved and try to help manage the funds, or to find another way for it to be safely managed. So, these are all issues related to the pandemic, the good, the bad, and the ugly. The good, there's a ton of money. The bad, a ton of money coming out one time for families that are in the throes of addiction or that are in very early recovery that's not yet real stable. And remember, we don't even talk about, you really can't even talk about relapse unless they've had really a few years of recovery, solid recovery under their belt. And we really look for 5 years, just like other chronic diseases, to say you're in remission. So really, you're not relapsing early like that. You're returning to use, the use that you've had probably for years, maybe decades, and that we expect to see to some degree for till you get more stable recovery. So I don't know if that answers the question, but there's a lot mixed into that one to unpack there. And I do know that the pandemic really had an adverse effect on families that were poor, that didn't have, the families I deal with, and especially in some of my other grants, one grant I work on, they'll have 20 or 30 people living in a 1-bedroom house, literally sleeping, next to the stove on like no mattresses. We're talking, you just find a piece of floor and lay down. So if people don't understand that's what we're dealing with, and you don't put that when you're writing the grant reviewer isn't going to have the benefit of knowing, this is how the pandemic has affected people. There is no social distance opportunity. Some of the places I work, they don't have running water, or they don't have clean water, or they have an outhouse, or they have things, whatever it is. And then also I'm in a small rural community where a lot of people don't even believe that there is COVID. And now we've had so many deaths that's finally turning around because it's undeniable at some point. But these are the things you have to help these grant reviewers understand, not in a judgmental way, but this is what we're dealing with here. This is what we have to, our funds will go to address in some way. And so if you're, let's say you're dealing with the pandemic and you're dealing with like my town where more than half the town doesn't even think it exists. If I'm going to do outreach, I got to have people that those folks go to church with, that they hang out with, that they find as truthful, reliable people to do the outreach. So you want to, again, get that consistency between what has the issues has the pandemic raised, and then how am I going to incorporate my rural community, and what kind of messaging, and who is the messenger. And, if you're not working with the faith community, and you're not working with some of the preachers that are, understand the disease, or have had or using people who believe the same, but now they have family members who have passed away, that now they have maybe a different viewpoint to share. So I don't know if that's what you're looking for, but that's what I'm thinking about.
Oh, it was such a broad question. I think that was an excellent response.
No way to go wrong with that one, Travis.
You kind of tied everything together, bringing all the different players in your actual grant application, so that the reviewers can see those, hopefully see those individuals through your writing. I think that was a fantastic response. That is all the questions that we have at this time, I believe. And I just want to make anyone on the webinar right now aware that we are going to be sending out a certificate of attendance, and there will also be a brief survey. And we talked a lot about collecting data and the difficulties collecting data. And I can't stress to you guys enough how much we need that data, and we need your feedback, because it really helps us put out better programming and helps us improve our efforts in the future. So if you would please consider clicking on the link whenever you get it. It's a very brief survey. Let us know how we did. And I'm going to turn it over to Karen.
Yeah.
Thank you guys. Good luck writing, you unicorns.
Wait.
Just go
Don't
out
leave.
there. Oh, yeah.
Don't leave, Pam.
Okay.
Something to you.
Okay.
Also, we told the participants in part 1 and part 2 that we'll show the video, so that will be ready in a few days. So anyone that's watching, we will have the videos available for you, and we'll send that link out as well. Pam, I just want to say that, on behalf of MORE, we just want to thank you for being with us today. Thank you for sharing your experience with us. It has been really informative, and I cannot stress enough that you are what every grant writer should aspire to be. So
thank you.
Yeah, definitely lucky to have you on here today. So just thank you.
And do you mind telling that to my children who think they need long-term therapy because of their early childhood experiences or?
Send me their number. I'll send them a text.
Thank you. I'm only kind of kidding, but okay, thank you.
All right, everyone. Thank you. Goodbye.
Bye.
Thank you, Pam.
No problem. See ya.